Jake Morrison pressed his back against the cold metal wall and tried to stop his teeth from chattering. The detention bay of the Arcturus Prime was colder than any winter he had ever felt on Earth. Ice crystals formed on the walls, and his breath came out in white clouds that disappeared quickly in the freezing air. He had been on this prison ship for 3 weeks now, and every day felt like a lifetime. The Valerian Empire knew how to break prisoners, and the cold was their favorite tool. Most alien species could not handle temperatures this low, and the Empire used that weakness against them. Jake looked around the detention bay through the small window in his cell door. Dozens of other prisoners sat in similar cells, all shivering and trying to stay warm. Some were tall and thin, like walking sticks. Others were short and covered in fur that did not seem to help them much in this cold. A few had scales instead, of skin, and they looked the worst of all. The guards walked by every few hours in their thick, warm suits. They would laugh and make jokes about the prisoners while they checked the locks. Jake had learned to hate the sound of their voices. Commander Blackwell was the worst of them all. He was a tall man with cold eyes who seemed to enjoy watching. Others suffer. Jake remembered the day he was captured. Colony 7 had been his home for 2 years. When the Empire attacked, he had led a group of fighters to protect the families there. They had held out for 6 days, but it was not enough. The Empire had too many ships and too many soldiers. In the end, Jake had been forced to surrender to save the civilians. Now he was on his way to Kryn 4, an ice planet where prisoners were sent to die slowly. The Empire called it a prison colony, but everyone knew it was really a death sentence. No one had ever escaped from Kryn 4, and most prisoners did not live through their first winter there. A soft sound from the cell next to his made Jake turn his head. Through the gap between the cells, he could see part of another prisoner. This one was different from the others he had seen. She looked almost human, but her skin had a blue tint to it, and she was shaking worse than anyone else in the detention bay. Jake had noticed her on his first day here. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair that hung around her face. Her eyes were large, and a strange silver color that seemed to glow in the dim light. She never made much noise, but he could tell she was suffering more than the rest of them. The guards had mentioned that she was from a water world called Meridia. Her people were used to warm oceans and tropical climates. The cold here was killing her slowly, and everyone could see it. Her lips had turned blue days ago, and now her whole face had that same cold color. Jake watched as she tried to wrap her thin prison clothes tighter around herself. It did not help much. The Empire gave all prisoners the same gray uniform that was designed to provide no warmth at all. On someone from a warm world like hers, it might as well have been made of paper. She looked up and caught him watching her. For a moment, their eyes met through the gap between the cells. Jake saw something in her expression that made his chest hurt. It was not just cold or fear. It was the look of someone who had given up hope. Jake had seen that look before. During the war, he had watched good soldiers lose their will to fight. Once that happened, they usually died within days. This alien woman had the same empty stare, and Jake knew she did not have much time left. He tried to think of something he could do to help her. The cells were designed to keep prisoners apart, but there was a small space where the walls did not quite meet. Jake had noticed it before, but had not thought much about it. Now he wondered if it might be big enough for something useful. The woman shivered again and wrapped her arms around herself. Jake could see her breath coming faster as she tried to stay warm. Her fingers had turned white at the tips, and he knew that was a bad sign. On Earth, frostbite started that way, and if it got worse, she could lose parts of her hands. The sound of boots on metal made all the prisoners look up. Commander Blackwell was making his evening rounds with 2 guards. They stopped at several cells to check on the prisoners and make their cruel comments. When they reached the woman's cell, Blackwell looked in and smiled. "Still alive, I see," he said in a voice that sounded disappointed. "Your people are tougher than I thought. Most of the cold bloods are dead by now." The woman did not answer. She just stared at the floor and continued shivering. Blackwell tapped his stick against the cell door, and the sound echoed through the bay. "Don't worry," he continued. "Kryn 4 will finish what we started here. The ice storms there will freeze you, solid in minutes. At least then you'll finally be useful as a decoration." The guards laughed at their commander's joke. Jake felt his hands form into fists, but there was nothing he could do. Fighting back would only make things worse for everyone. After the guards left, Jake looked over at the woman again. She had curled up in the corner of her cell with her knees pulled up to her chest. The shivering was getting worse, and Jake could hear her teeth chattering from his own cell. Something inside Jake rebelled against just watching her die. He had been a soldier, and soldiers did not abandon their fellow fighters. It did not matter that she was from another world, or that helping her might bring punishment. She was suffering, and he had to try to do something about it. Jake moved closer to the gap between their cells. He could see her better now, and noticed that her breathing was becoming shallow. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Jake thought she might be trying to pray, or maybe just talking to herself to stay conscious. He reached his hand toward the gap to see if it was big enough. His arm could fit through up to his elbow. It was not much, but it might be enough. Jake looked around to make sure no guards were watching, then pushed his hand through the space between the cells. The woman noticed the movement and looked up with frightened eyes. Jake held his hand still and tried to look as non-threatening as possible. After a moment, she seemed to understand that he was trying to help. She looked at his outstretched hand and then back at his face. "Warm," she whispered in a voice so quiet Jake almost missed it. She said the word in Universal Standard, the common language used throughout the galaxy. Her accent was strange and musical, but Jake understood her perfectly. She was asking for warmth, and Jake realized he might be able to give her exactly what she needed. Human body temperature was higher than most alien species. What felt normal to him would feel warm to her. It was not much, but it might be enough to keep her alive a little longer. Jake kept his hand extended and waited to see what she would do. The woman stared at Jake's outstretched hand for a long moment. Her silver eyes moved from his face to his hand and back again. Jake could see her trying to decide if she could trust him. In a place like this, trust was dangerous, but so was dying, alone. Slowly, she moved closer to the gap between their cells. Her movements were stiff and painful from the cold. When she reached the wall, she hesitated again. Jake kept his hand perfectly still and tried to look as friendly as possible. "It's okay," he whispered in Universal Standard. His accent was rough, but she seemed to understand. The woman reached out with one trembling hand and gently touched his fingers. The moment their skin made contact, she gasped. Jake's human body temperature felt like a warm fire to her cold flesh. She quickly grabbed his hand with both of hers and held on tight. Jake felt how cold she was. Her skin was like ice, and he could feel her shaking through their joined hands. But as the minutes passed, he noticed her trembling starting to slow down. The warmth from his body was flowing into hers and giving her the heat she desperately needed. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was still weak, but it sounded stronger than before. Jake smiled and squeezed her hands gently. "What's your name?" "Zara," she replied. "Zara Velnoth." "I'm Jake Morrison. I'm from Earth." Zara nodded. She had heard of humans before, but had never met one. On her world, they told stories about the strange, warm-blooded species that came from a planet with no oceans. She had always thought those stories were made up. They sat like that for almost an hour, hands connected through the gap. Jake could feel Zara's body temperature slowly rising. The blue color was fading from her lips and her breathing was becoming more regular. For the first time since he had been captured, Jake felt like he was doing something useful. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Jake started to pull his hand back, but Zara held on tighter. She was not ready to let go of the warmth yet. The footsteps passed by without stopping, and they both relaxed. "Why are you helping me?" Zara asked when the danger had passed. Jake thought about the question. He could have given her a simple answer about helping fellow prisoners or fighting the Empire together. But the real reason was more basic than that. "Because you need help," he said simply. "And I can give it." Zara looked puzzled. On her world, help always came with a price. People did favors because they expected something in return. The idea of helping someone just because they needed it was strange to her. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," Jake replied. "I just want you to not die." This answer seemed to confuse Zara even more. She studied Jake's face through the gap, trying to understand what kind of person would risk punishment to help a stranger. After a few minutes, she seemed to accept that he was telling the truth. "Your people are very strange," she said finally. Jake laughed quietly. "Yeah, we get that a lot." They talked in whispers while they held hands. Zara told Jake about her home world, Meridia, with its warm oceans and floating cities. She described swimming through coral forests and diving to ocean depths where strange creatures glowed with their own light. It sounded like paradise to Jake, who had grown up on the dry plains of Earth. Jake told Zara about his planet with its vast continents and diverse climates. He described snow-covered mountains and burning deserts, great forests, and endless grasslands. Zara was amazed that one world could have so many different environments. "No wonder your people are so adaptable," she said. "You had to learn to survive everywhere." As they talked, other prisoners began to notice what was happening. Some watched with curiosity, while others seemed suspicious. A few moved closer to their own cell walls to get a better look at the human who was sharing his warmth with an alien. One prisoner in particular seemed very interested in Jake's actions. This was Dr. Kex Thornfield, a member of the insect-like Vex species. He had been watching Jake since the first day and trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Most species in the galaxy were focused on their own survival above all else. The idea of risking safety to help someone from a different world was almost unheard of. Dr. Thornfield had been a scientist before his capture. He studied different species and how they interacted with each other. In all his research, he had never seen behavior quite like Jake's. It went against everything he understood about survival instincts and species loyalty. When the lights dimmed for the sleep period, Jake finally had to let go of Zara's hands. She was reluctant to break the connection, but she understood that he needed rest too. Her color was much better now, and she was no longer shaking uncontrollably. "Will you do this again tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. "As often as I can," Jake promised. That night, Jake slept better than he had since his capture. For the first time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving until they reached Kryn 4. He had someone counting on him, and that gave him strength. The next morning brought new challenges. Commander Blackwell noticed that Zara looked healthier than she had the day before. Her skin had more color, and she was sitting up straight instead of huddled in a corner. This made him suspicious. "You look better today," Blackwell said when he stopped at her cell. "Did someone give you extra food? Or maybe you found a way to stay warm?" Zara kept her eyes down and did not answer. Blackwell looked around at the other prisoners, trying to spot anything unusual. His gaze lingered on Jake for a moment, but he did not seem to suspect anything. "If I find out someone is breaking the rules, there will be consequences," Blackwell warned. "For everyone." After the commander left, Jake and Zara waited several hours before connecting hands again. They had to be more careful now, but Jake was not going to stop helping her. The threat of punishment meant nothing compared to watching her suffer. Throughout the day, other prisoners watched their interactions with growing interest. Some began to whisper among themselves about the human who was willing to risk himself for an alien. A few seemed inspired by Jake's example and started looking for ways to help each other. Dr. Thornfield finally approached Jake during the evening meal period. The Vex scientist had 4 arms and large compound eyes that could see in many directions at once. His appearance was frightening to most species, but Jake had learned not to judge by looks. "I have been observing your behavior," Dr. Thornfield said in his clicking voice. "It is most unusual." "Is that good or bad?" Jake asked. "It is hopeful," the doctor replied. "I have studied many species, but I have never seen such selfless behavior toward a non-family member from a different world. Your actions suggest that cooperation between species might be possible on a level I had not considered." Jake was not sure he understood all of the scientific talk, but he got the basic idea. "I'm just trying to help someone who needs it." "Yes," Dr. Thornfield said, "and that simple act may be more important than you realize." As the days passed, Jake continued to share his warmth with Zara whenever possible. Their brief conversations became the highlight of both their days. Zara taught Jake words in her musical language, while he shared stories of Earth's history and culture. More importantly, other prisoners began following Jake's example. Species that had never trusted each other started sharing food and offering comfort to those who were suffering most. The cold detention bay slowly began to feel less hostile as the prisoners realized they were all in the same situation together. The change in the detention bay was slow but unmistakable. What had started as Jake's simple act of kindness toward Zara began spreading to other prisoners like ripples in a pond. Species that had spent centuries at war with each other were now sharing what little they had. A tall, thin prisoner from the desert world of Keth began giving half his water ration to a furry creature from an ice moon who needed extra hydration. 2 rock-like beings from different asteroid belts worked together to create small shelters from torn pieces of their prison uniforms. Even the most suspicious prisoners started to lower their guard slightly. Dr. Thornfield watched these developments with the keen interest of a scientist observing a remarkable experiment. He had spent his career studying species interaction and had never seen anything like this before. The human's behavior was somehow contagious in the best possible way. "Your example is creating something unprecedented," he told Jake during one of their whispered conversations. "I have studied interspecies relations for 40 years, and this level of cooperation between natural enemies should be impossible." Jake was holding Zara's hands through the gap as they talked. Her condition had improved dramatically over the past week. The dangerous blue color had left her skin completely, and she was able to stay warm for longer periods between their contact sessions. "People just need to see that it's possible," Jake replied. "Most folks are good inside. They just need someone to show them it's safe to be kind." Dr. Thornfield's compound eyes reflected light in a way that Jake had learned meant he was thinking deeply. "On my world, we have a saying. The first crack in the dam releases the flood. You may have created the first crack in barriers that have existed for millennia." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of angry voices from the guard station. Commander Blackwell was shouting at his subordinates about the changing behavior of the prisoners. He had noticed the cooperation, and it made him nervous. "Prisoners are supposed to be broken and hopeless," Blackwell's voice carried across the detention bay. "Instead, they're acting like they have something to fight for. Find out what's causing this change and stop it immediately." Jake felt Zara's hands tighten around his. They both knew that increased scrutiny from the guards could mean trouble for everyone. But Jake also knew he could not stop helping her. She was depending on him, and he would not let her down. That evening, Zara revealed something that changed everything. As they held hands in their usual spot, she spoke in a voice so quiet, Jake had to strain to hear her. "I need to tell you something important," she said. "I am not just a resistance fighter. I am the daughter of High Admiral Kane Velnoth, the leader of Meridia's naval forces." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. If Zara was the daughter of a high-ranking military leader, then she was far more valuable to the Empire than he had realized. It also meant she was in much greater danger. "The Empire captured me because they knew my father would never surrender while they held me," Zara continued. "But they also know I have information about a planned offensive against the rebel worlds. If they can break me, they can save dozens of their fleets." "What kind of information?" Jake asked. "Location data for hidden bases, supply routes, communication codes," Zara replied. "Everything they would need to crush the resistance in 3 sectors. Jake understood now why the Empire was keeping her alive despite her obvious suffering. They needed her conscious and able to talk. The cold was meant to weaken her will but not kill her outright. "Have you told them anything?" he asked. "Nothing," Zara said firmly. "But I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The cold makes it hard to think clearly, and they have drugs that can make anyone talk eventually." Jake squeezed her hands gently. "Then we need to make sure they don't get the chance to use those drugs." Before Zara could ask what he meant, Dr. Thornfield appeared at Jake's cell door. The Vex scientist looked excited in a way that was unusual for his normally calm species. "I have been working on something," he whispered. "A way to generate heat using materials I have gathered from the ship's maintenance areas. But I need your help to make it work." Jake listened as Dr. Thornfield explained his plan. Using his scientific knowledge and scraps of metal and wire collected by other prisoners, he had designed a small heating device. The problem was that it needed to be connected to the ship's power grid to function, and that meant someone would have to access the electrical conduits during a maintenance cycle. "The conduits carry enough power to kill most species instantly," Dr. Thornfield explained. "But humans have higher electrical resistance than other races. You might be able to survive the exposure long enough to make the connection." Jake looked around the detention bay at all the prisoners who were now working together because of what he had started. He thought about Zara and the information she carried that could save countless lives. The choice was not difficult. "When Paturs, do we do it?" he asked. "Tomorrow during the sleep cycle," Dr. Thornfield replied. "The maintenance robots will be working on the power systems, and there will be a brief window when the conduits are accessible. The next day passed slowly as Jake tried to act normal while preparing for the dangerous task ahead. He continued his routine of sharing warmth with Zara, but he could tell she sensed something was different. Her silver eyes watched him with concern. "You're planning something dangerous," she said during their afternoon session. Jake tried to smile reassuringly. "Just trying to make things better for everyone." "Don't do anything foolish because of me," Zara said firmly. "I'm not worth risking your life." "You're wrong about that," Jake replied. "And it's not just about you anymore. It's about all of us." That evening brought unexpected trouble. Commander Blackwell had become increasingly frustrated with the cooperation among the prisoners and decided to make an example. He chose Jake as his target, either by coincidence or because he had finally figured out who was behind the changes. "In the detention bay, Morrison!" Blackwell called out as he approached Jake's cell with 4 guards. "You're being transferred to solitary confinement. Maybe some time alone in the coldest part of the ship will remind you what happens to troublemakers." Jake felt his stomach drop. If they moved him now, he would not be able to help Dr. Thornfield with the heating device. More importantly, he would not be able to continue helping Zara. Without his warmth, she might not survive until they reached Kryn 4. "What did I do wrong?" Jake asked, though he knew arguing was useless. "You exist," Blackwell replied coldly. "That's enough." As the guards unlocked his cell, Jake looked over at Zara one last time. She was pressed against the gap between their cells with tears in her silver eyes. Her hands were stretched toward him, but the guards were already pulling him away. "I'll find a way back to you," Jake called out as they dragged him toward the exit. "I promise." The last thing he saw before they hauled him out of the detention bay was Dr. Thornfield's compound eyes watching from his cell. The vexed scientist gave a small nod that Jake hoped meant he would continue with their plan even without Jake's help. The solitary confinement cells were located in the coldest section of the ship, near the outer hull where space's endless winter could penetrate the metal walls. As the guards threw Jake into his new cell, he felt the temperature drop by at least 20 degrees. This was where prisoners came to die, Jake realized. The Empire did not need to execute troublemakers when they could simply let the cold do their work for them. As the cell door slammed shut, Jake heard Commander Blackwell's voice one last time. "Let's see how long your human warmth lasts in here. Morrison, I give you 3 days before you're begging us to put you back with the others." Alone in the freezing darkness, Jake pressed his back against the wall and tried to stay warm. But even as his own body temperature began to drop, he was thinking about Zara and the other prisoners. His simple act of kindness had started something bigger than himself, and he had to believe it would continue even without him. Somewhere in the detention bay, Zara was getting colder, and Dr. Thornfield was preparing to risk everything for a heating device that might save them all. Jake closed his eyes and held on to the hope that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The solitary confinement cell was a tomb of ice and metal. Jake could see his breath forming thick clouds in the air, and ice crystals were already starting to form on the walls around him. The temperature here was cold enough to kill most alien species within hours. But Jake's human physiology gave him a fighting chance. He pressed himself into the corner where 2 walls met, trying to conserve body heat. His prison uniform was useless against this level of cold, but he wrapped it tighter, around himself anyway. Every few minutes he would do jumping jacks or push-ups to keep his blood flowing, though the exercise made him hungrier and he had no idea when his next meal would come. Back in the main detention bay, Zara was struggling without Jake's warmth. The blue tint was returning to her skin and her shivering had started again. She pressed herself against the gap where Jake's hand used to reach through, hoping somehow to feel his presence again. Dr. Thornfield watched Zara's condition with growing concern. Without Jake's regular warming sessions, she would not last much longer. The heating device he had been working on was more important than ever, but accessing the power conduits without Jake's electrical resistance would be extremely dangerous. "We have to try anyway," he told the other prisoners who had gathered around his cell. "The humans showed us that helping others is worth the risk." The group had grown into an unlikely team. There was Captain Betty Kane, a former military officer, from the mining colonies who had been captured during a supply raid. Next to her stood Hal Rogers, a mechanic who understood ship systems better than anyone. A tall alien named Vryn from the forest world of Altara had volunteered to help despite his species' natural fear of electricity. "Jake would want us to continue," Betty said in her gruff voice. "He started something here that's bigger than any one person." They waited until the sleep cycle when the maintenance robots would be working on the ship's systems. Dr. Thornfield had calculated that there would be a 15-minute window when the power conduits would be accessible for repairs. During that time, someone would need to attach his heating device to the power grid without getting electrocuted. Hal had volunteered for the dangerous job. His species had slightly better electrical resistance than most, though nowhere near human levels. "I've worked with power systems before," he said. "I know how to be careful." While the others prepared for their mission, Zara was fighting her own battle against the cold. She had discovered that moving closer to other prisoners helped slightly, as their body heat provided some warmth. But it was not enough to replace what Jake had given her. In desperation, she began sharing what she knew about surviving extreme conditions. Her people had developed techniques for slowing their metabolism during cold periods, similar to hibernation. It was dangerous and could cause permanent damage, but it might keep her alive long enough for rescue. "My body will shut down most of its functions," she explained to the prisoners near her. "But I need someone to watch me and make sure I don't stop breathing completely." Betty moved her bedding closer to Zara's cell. "I'll keep an eye on you. Just focus on staying alive." As Zara began the dangerous process of lowering her body temperature voluntarily, Dr. Thornfield and his team made their move. The maintenance robots had arrived on schedule and were working on various ship systems. The power conduits were exposed and accessible, but they crackled with deadly energy. Hal approached the conduit carefully, carrying Dr. Thornfield's heating device. It was a crude thing made from scavenged metal and wire, but the Vex scientists' calculations suggested it would work. The trick was connecting it without becoming part of the electrical circuit. "Remember," Dr. Thornfield whispered, "attach the positive lead first, then the negative. If you do it backwards, the feedback could kill you instantly." Hal nodded and reached toward the conduit with the first wire. The moment it made contact, sparks flew, and he jerked his hand back with a curse. His arm was numb from the electrical shock, but he was still alive. "I can't do this," he said, looking at his trembling hands. "The voltage is too high." In his solitary cell, Jake felt his strength fading. He had been without food for 2 days, and the cold was sapping his energy faster than he could replace it. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Zara's silver eyes and the trust she had placed in him. He forced himself to do another set of exercises, moving his stiff muscles to keep circulation going. His human body was tougher than most species realized. Humans had evolved on a world with extreme weather variations, and that adaptation was serving him well now. Jake also thought about the other prisoners and how they had started working together. That cooperation was his real legacy, more important than any individual act of kindness. Even if he died in this frozen cell, the bonds he had helped create would continue. Back in the detention bay, Dr. Thornfield was facing a difficult decision. Hal could not handle the electrical current needed to connect the heating device. No other prisoner had the necessary resistance to survive the shock. Without Jake, their plan seemed doomed to failure. But then Vryn stepped forward. The tall forest dweller had been thinking about Jake's sacrifice and what it meant. "I will try," he said simply. "The human risked himself for strangers. I can do the same for my fellow prisoners." Dr. Thornfield tried to talk him out of it. "Your species has even lower electrical resistance than Hal's. The shock could stop your heart instantly." "Then we must work quickly," Vryn replied. Before anyone could stop him, Vryn grabbed the heating device and approached the power conduit. He moved with the quick grace of his forest-dwelling people, attaching both wires almost simultaneously. The electrical shock threw him backward against the wall, but the connection held. Dr. Thornfield's heating device began to glow with warmth. It was not much, barely enough to raise the temperature by a few degrees, but it was something more. Importantly, it proved that the prisoners could work together to improve their situation. Vryn was unconscious, but alive. His sacrifice had succeeded where caution had failed. The other prisoners gathered around the heating device, taking turns warming their hands and sharing the precious heat. Meanwhile, Commander Blackwell was becoming increasingly suspicious about the prisoners' behavior. Despite removing Jake from the detention bay, the cooperation between species was continuing. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger. "There's something going on," he told his guards. "Prisoners don't normally work together like this. Someone is organizing them, and I want to know who." He decided to make another example, this time choosing Dr. Thornfield as his target. The Vex scientist was clearly intelligent and influential among the other prisoners. Removing him might finally break their spirit. But before Blackwell could act, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The Arcturus Prime was approaching the Ember Fields, a nebula known for its dangerous electromagnetic storms. These storms could disable ship systems and create navigation hazards. "All crew to emergency stations," came the announcement over the ship's communication system. "Electromagnetic storm approaching. Prepare for system failures." In his solitary cell, Jake heard the alarms and felt a spark of hope. Electromagnetic storms were dangerous, but they also created opportunities. Ship systems would be unreliable, and the guards would be distracted by emergency procedures. If there was ever going to be a chance for escape, this was it. In the detention bay, the prisoners sensed the change in their situation. The ship's lights flickered as the first wave of electromagnetic energy hit the hull. Emergency lighting activated, casting everything in a red glow that made the ice crystals on the walls look like blood. "This is our chance," Betty said to the others. "If we're going to act, it has to be now." Dr. Thornfield looked around at the faces of his fellow prisoners. Species that had been enemies for generations were now united by a common cause. It had started with one human's simple act of kindness, but it had grown into something much larger. "Jake showed us that we don't have to accept what they do to us," he said. "Now we show them what we learned from his example." The electromagnetic storm hit with full force, and the prisoners of the Arcturus Prime prepared to fight for their freedom. The electromagnetic storm struck the Arcturus Prime like an invisible fist. Ship lights flickered and died, emergency power kicked in, and the familiar hum of the engines changed to an irregular stutter. In the chaos that followed, the united prisoners made their move. Dr. Thornfield had spent weeks studying the ship's layout through careful observation. He knew which systems would fail first during an electromagnetic event and exactly how long they would have before backup power restored. The security measures. The heating device he had built was more than just a source of warmth. It was also a tool that could overload the cell locking mechanisms when the power grid was unstable. Now, he whispered to the others as sparks flew from the control panels. Betty kicked at her cell door just as Dr. Thornfield sent a power surge through the locking system. The electromagnetic interference combined with the electrical overload caused a cascade failure throughout the detention bay. One by one, cell doors began to slide open. The prisoners moved quickly but carefully. Most had been weakened by weeks of cold and poor food, but desperation gave them strength. Species that had never trusted each other now worked as a coordinated team. The tall desert dwellers used their long arms to reach controls, while the small furry creatures squeezed through maintenance shafts to disable security sensors. "We need to get Jake," Zara said as soon as her cell opened. She was still weak from her hibernation attempt, but determination kept her moving. "The solitary cells are 3 levels down," Betty replied. "That means going through guard stations and security checkpoints." "Then we go through them," Zara said simply. As they made their way through the ship's corridors, the freed prisoners discovered something remarkable. Some of the guards were hesitant to fight them. Jake's example of compassion had not gone unnoticed by everyone on the ship. A few crew members, particularly those from species that had suffered under the Empire's rule, seemed unwilling to fire on prisoners who were clearly trying to help.